Det er hjerterommet det trangt. Det er bra det trangt når vi diskuterer feminisme. En hel 2 ukers periode nå så er det kvinnefestival i Bergen. Det er mange fine arrangementer som er med i år, utvidet til neste år. Det er alltid ulike perspektiver å sette på det. Og det er fint å ta med litt ekstra program og deler ut til andre feminister. Lyst til å annonsere spesielt for et møte som vi i fagforeningen skal ha til et morgenmøte fredag 14 om likelønn. Det er her på Litteraturhuset. Jeg legger det på bordet der, så kan dere ta med dere hvis dere har lyst. Så ellers finner dere det på nettet. Det som ikke finnes i brosjyren, det er ungdomskonserten som skal være i Gimle i kveld. Og det er et rusfritt alternativ, og der er masse jentebær. Jo, men hva? Ja, det var intervju med deg i avisen i dag, så da går han og lese aviser og få informasjon om det. De har gjort en kjempejobb, og det er bra, vi trenger unge jenter med oss. Så da legger jeg litt der, og så håper jeg at dere finner veien på arrangementene.
Ja, Rachel Moran, she has taken the journey over to Bergen for the 3rd time, and the 2nd time that she gives a lecture here in Bergen. And this day, the International Women's Day is a special occasion, and we are very proud to have you here and to show how we do that day here in Bergen. And therefore we have booked her in 3 times during the 8th of March here in Bergen. The first part, she will speak to you, and then she will speak at the open rally meeting at Almenningen. And when the demonstration ends up in Scandic Hotel, you will find her there as well. Yeah. And you will never hear the same thing 3 times. No. She has taken all her papers and sort of that's it. But today the topic is 8 myths about prostitution. But in fact, we have counted it up now to be 18 myths about prostitution. And Rachel Moran is also the author of the book Paid For, My Journey Through Prostitution. And we will recommend you that you lend it at the library, but preferably buy it so you can lend it on you as well. And this is a very rare book because I think it is 30 years ago since we had a book so important about the issue. And the last time was Catherine Berry's Female Sexual Slavery. So it isn't easy to write such a book, and it isn't easy to be a good writer and an author who has a distance to the topic, even if you have the experience yourself. So a big hand for you, Rachel, giving us this book. Go to Nordli and say, order this, please. And there will be a launch party in New York coming week, next Monday, for the book in New York. Okay, I want as short sentence from Rachel's many opinions. She says that prostitusjon ikke verneverdig. Prostitusjon vold mot kvinner. And she says, og hun sier forsvar sexkjøpsloven. I said that we don't have to defend prostitution. Prostitution is violence against women. We have to forsvare, to what? Defend our realization by no sex. Okay. Arrangørene i dag mange. Det Kvinnefronten, som jeg kommer fra. Det Bergen SV. Det partiet Rødt Bergen. Og det Bergen Arbeiderparti. Og vi har hele tiden gjennom mange år samarbeidet om dette temaet, og vi må nok ikke gi oss enda. Nei. I just said that there are 4 organizations behind this event. It's Women's Front, it is the women's branch of the Social Left, and the Bergen Social Democratic Party, and the Party Red women's branch. And we will continue to stick together around this and then it's yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Agneta. Okay, first of all, we have 18 basic myths here. These have been highlighted by the European Women's Lobby. And I'm just going to run through these myths and talk very briefly about each one of them and why they're nonsense. And like Agneta said, we went from 8 to 18 and we could very easily go to 118 and above, I'm sure. Because there are a lot of myths around prostitution, and some of them I bought into myself while I was in that situation, simply because it made living prostitution easier. It made it easier on different levels, especially when you were speaking to people who were going to repeat your words in public, for the simple reason that when you're in a very, very painful situation, it's much easier to pretend that you have some kind of autonomy or control over that situation. But I'm sure I've come across that here somewhere in the mix. The first one is that prostitution is the oldest profession in the world. And what I notice about these different myths is that very often the way that the myths themselves are framed, they're self-contradictory, because prostitution is very clearly not a profession. When I hear that prostitution is the oldest profession, I always just say, okay, stop right there, because prostitution is not a profession, it is a predicament. And there's a very big difference, of course, between a profession and a predicament. And prostitution is actually the only mode of making money that I can think of that is framed as a profession when it's very clearly a predicament. Nobody would say that the sale of your internal organs was a profession. Nobody would say that working in, if you were labour trafficked, that you were in a profession. So it really is the only circumstance I can think of that's falsely reframed as a profession, and I don't think it's any kind of coincidence that it's women in this world who are in the situation of being exploited and yet being told that they are professionals. Professional exploitees, yes, okay. It's a job like any other, okay? So one moment it's a profession, now it's a job, which is it, in fact it's neither. So that's the second myth, that it is a job. And the European Women's Lobby point out here that there are no other jobs where people face a mortality rate that's been documented as between 10 and 40 times higher above the national average when we're talking about, homicide. That would be considered bizarre anywhere else. But in prostitution, it's accepted as being a part of the job. So if prostitution is a job, well then we have to accept that homicide is an occupational hazard. So if we look at a myth like that, we can really see the preposterous nature of it when we look at the conditions of prostitution. And this is what I always do when I'm debating people who tell me that prostitution is a job and it's a profession. And I say, okay, well if we're going to talk about prostitution as simply a job or a profession, then we have to talk about the skill sets, okay, what the skill sets are and what the occupational hazards are. And I think what we really need to, and I'm just conscious, I know that there's a couple of babies in the room, which is fine, but I wonder, are there any very young children, because there's stuff that I need. No? Okay. We need to talk about the occupational hazards if we're going to talk about prostitution, in any terms, but particularly as a job. What you have to be able to do in prostitution is to close off your mind while your body is being penetrated, anally, orally, vaginally, every way. If they could fit it in your ear hole or up your nostril, it would go up there too. This is what you have to deal with as a part of your skill set. This is what you have to be able to do. You have to be able to imagine away what's happening to you and make like it's normal, okay? So we want to look at, let's say, waitressing, for example, which is a job that I've done. No matter what way you're earning money on this earth, there's certain things that you have to get used to that you're not going to like. Sometimes you'll have to deal with boredom, frustration. Sometimes you'll have to deal with monotony, no matter what you're doing to earn a living. But these things are acceptable because they're not hugely, deeply damaging to the human psyche. But we look at prostitution very often, and usually it is from the outside-in perspective. Thank God most people on the earth haven't experienced this. But the drawback from that is that most people on the earth don't understand, from a personal perspective, the very deeply damaging nature of what prostitution is. Now I'm glad that they don't, but it leaves us in a position where it's much easier for prostitution to be normalised. And that's aided and abetted by all these kind of programs, these ridiculous television series where women are presented as, you know, very richly, financially rewarded women who spend the majority of their time in five-star hotels or upmarket boutiques. They're always depicted in high heels, you know, living very, very extravagant lifestyles. And of course that's not true. It's not true in most cases. But even in the cases where it is true, because I have spoken to women who've been prostituted at the absolute elite end. For example, in Parisian prostitution, as one woman contacted me recently, and she was paid €2,000 for a 2-hour session, of which the agency took 50%. And even at that level, the level of abuse that went on, that this young woman described to me, for example, one particular, this is a teenager by the way, she had one punter, as we call them in Ireland, who wanted to have sex with her without a condom. She said absolutely no way. She ran out of the hotel room. He got very insistent, he got physical, she ran out of the hotel room. And she called the agency in her naivety, thinking that they would say, oh, that's okay, that's fine, just get out of there. But no, she was told, get back into that room and mop up the mess that you've made. Because what these men are paying €2,000, like, are you for real, was the attitude she got. So she was told to get back into the hotel room, have sex without a condom, which she did, and then had to go worry about HIV and every other STI and unplanned pregnancy and all of that stuff. So when we look at prostitution in the context of a job or a profession, well then we can't say that this is sexual abuse, that this is rape. People won't even say that this is coercive sex, because it's a job. So that is a real danger with calling something a job just because it's been compensated. I've said many times publicly that prostitution is compensated abuse, which is what it is, and you can't call that a job by anybody's standards. Now another one here, prostitution brings women economic independence, especially to migrant women. Well, very briefly I would say that there is, we've moved beyond the issue of oppression against women here and interlinked it with racial oppression, because if that is the best that we have to offer migrant women, we really need to take a good look at ourselves and our societies. Because what is not okay for our own women should never be okay for migrant women. This is one of the myths that disgusts me most, although I have issue with all of them. It is a choice, is the fourth. Okay, well I've said before many times, and some of you have probably heard me say already, we can never ever talk about prostitution and the choice of prostitution without examining the context in which those choices are made. I gave an interview to a journalist over 20 years ago. I was about 16 or 17 at the time, and I came at her from the perspective that I had chosen this. She never thought to ask me what my other options were. I wish she had. Prostitution brings a lot of money. Yeah, but to who? You know, that's the question, to who? Because pimps, in my experience, take a minimum of 50%. That's at a minimum. My own pimp took about 95% when I began in prostitution. And even women who do earn a lot of money, and there were times, especially towards the end of my 7 years of prostitution, where I did earn a lot of money. I was earning £150 an hour at that time in Ireland at the late 90s. £150 an hour is a lot of money. But I came out of prostitution stone broke. I didn't have 1 cent of my name coming out of prostitution, and neither did any of the other women I knew or have met since. Women, the concept of dirty money in prostitution is so widespread. I mean, even this young woman I've just mentioned, who I spoke to recently, who'd been prostituted at that elite end of Parisian prostitution, she came out of prostitution with absolutely nothing, although she was earning $12,000 a week, you know. Her cocaine habit was developed and spiraled out of control over the span of 7 months. You know, she was using 4 or 5 grams a day over 7 months, which really horrified me, because I spent 3.5 years addicted to cocaine, and it took me 3.5 years to get up to 4 or 5 grams a day. It's very heartbreaking to me to think of a young woman in her late teens, she was 19, so distressed and traumatized by the life that she was living, that her cocaine addiction just ferociously went out of control in that short span of time. And it should say something in and of itself to people, because that's actually not normal. You know, it's not even physically, bodily, it's very abnormal for a person to get so used to cocaine so fast. She was living, breathing, sleeping cocaine in the matter of those few months, taking overdoses, accidental overdoses regularly. I know what that's like. And she also incidentally spoke to me about how her path into prostitution was heavily influenced by what she was looking at culturally on television. And these programs I've mentioned that present prostitution in a very glamorous, exclusive kind of light. You know, she wanted a slice of that. She wanted to spend her life tripping in and out of hotels and buying beautiful, expensive clothes. And the reality of what she would have to do to live that lifestyle was always minimized and glossed over by the agency, who didn't even refer to the teenagers and young women that they hired as call girls, never mind as prostitutes. They were framed as models. They were told they were models. These are the agency models. And in this particular agency, they had a 5-year span. The girls had to be between 18 and 23. Simply because the very wealthy businessmen who were coming in from all over the world to Paris, they wanted, as men generally want in prostitution, the youngest female available to them. So the reality of my life and the reality of everything that I witnessed in other women's lives in prostitution flies in direct opposition to all of the myths that I've heard, because they're talking about choice and sexual freedom and autonomy and all this. Well, if that's true, well then why are the females who are sought out always sought out as the younger the better? Because your market value in prostitution drops phenomenally year on year between your whatever age you happen to be when you go into it. I was 15, and I've said before that the difference between 15 and 18 and then 18 and 21 and so on and so forth, it's amazing how much your market value drops, how much less in demand you are, even in the space of 2 or 3 short years. And people would be shocked to really know, if they could only listen in on the brothel's phone lines. And I tweeted recently that I had answered the phones in enough brothels to know that the most overwhelmingly common question is, how young is the youngest girl that you've got? And when I say that that's overwhelmingly common, I mean for every 10 phone calls you take, you will hear that at least 8 or 9 times. You'll have that 8 or 9 times out of every 10 phone calls, because the concept of fresh meat is very much alive and kicking in these men's minds. That's what they want. They want the young, unspoiled, brand new, innocent young girl into prostitution. And that attitude in itself should say something about the drive or the purpose that's behind the purchase of sex, because it's very, very often despoilment. It's the act of despoilment. It is abusive in and of itself. So when I think about all these things and what the understanding I have from having lived it, I read this craziness. For example, the next one, prostitution is about sexual freedom. Whose sexual freedom? Because it's certainly not the sexual freedom of the women and girls sitting in the brothels. There's no sexual freedom to be had when you are the commodity on a plate. The concept of sexual freedom of women in prostitution is probably the most blatant lie of all. It's so blatantly false that I just have such contempt for anybody, quite simply, who's foolish enough to buy into it. Because, I mean, there's a lot about prostitution I couldn't expect people to understand from the perspective of not having been in a brothel. But I think that people are not fools either. And we understand that if, for example, let's look at different areas of commerce, although it's not always helpful to compare prostitution to different areas of commerce, but it is in some senses. When you look at another exploitative area of commerce, like somebody who is working round the clock. I worked as a journalist for quite some time, and I remember meeting a young woman who had been flown over from Thailand to pick mushrooms, and she was worked for like 18 hours a day. Very, very little time to eat or to sleep or to, you know, she was exploited through labour exploitation. And it's every bit as crazy to say that prostitution is about sexual freedom as it would be to say that this girl's predicament was about the freedom to express your labour picking mushrooms 18 hours a day. It's those people need to really take a look at what they're listening to about prostitution and put it in another context. Because when you do that, the ridiculousness slaps you right in the face. Here's another one that's closely linked and equally ridiculous. Prostitution is part of women's historical struggle to control their bodies. Okay. So when I was in the red light zones and the brothels, this was telling me that I was engaged in the deeply liberating struggle to control my own body. I actually wish somebody had told me that at the time. Well, I doubt it would have made life much easier. But you know, let's be real here. If you're in a brothel or you know, a high-end agency, and I work them all, you know, and somebody comes in and they pay you money, and believe me, when men in prostitution pay you money, they expect you to physically embody their fantasy. You have to be the living, breathing version of what they're fantasizing in their minds, which translates into, in a very graphic sense, you have to physically do everything it is that they want you to do, regardless how repulsive or unwanted it is yourself. Now, if anybody understands that and can say that prostitution is part of women's historical struggle to control their bodies, I don't think they understand anything about that sentence. They certainly don't understand what women's struggle to control their bodies actually is in the first place. That they couldn't possibly understand. I hope that what I'm saying here is so self-evidently obvious that I don't need to expand on it to any great extent. Some of these are very, very insulting to me personally, but I'm glad I'm at a point in my life where they're no longer upsetting. I remember back in around 2006, 2007, I'd been out of prostitution I got out in 98, so I was out the guts of a decade even at that time. And I remember I started to look into prostitution, what people were saying about prostitution, because I had begun to write my book. I was a few years into writing the book at that stage. but it was something I came and went from. I wasn't heavily engaged with it every day. But I remember looking around the internet and going into these different chat forums and listening to what people were saying and being so traumatized. I was so traumatized by what I was reading that I was vibrating with fear. I was shaking. I couldn't believe that, like I've said in the book, what I had lived, what I had suffered and what I had struggled through and endured and made it out of was actually being defended, wholly contorted, pulled inside out and served up in some kind of fashion that had no bearing on the reality at all, and in a lot of cases reflected the polar opposite of the reality that I had experienced and witnessed. So I was stunned, I was appalled, and I was deeply upset. I was very, very upset and traumatized, psychologically traumatized by what I was seeing, the conversations that people were having, and the smug ignorance, the really, really confident ignorance with which some people were speaking, and with which some people were repeating this nonsense. And these were people who, by their own admission, had never set foot in a brothel. You know, they were people who were just making assumptions and repeating those assumptions as if they were fact, and really standing over them and fighting, arguing tooth and nail that what they were saying was true, even though they'd never seen the inside of a brothel in their lives. And that shocked me. But I think that I needed to see that at that time, because I needed to know what I was faced with when I was eventually finished this book. So I kind of withdrew. I remember just withdrawing into myself and thinking, whoa, I had no idea that when I get to the other end of this book, this is what I'm going to be faced with. And I did need to know that. And that was a good 6-7 years before the book actually came out. But I'm very glad that I spent those few weeks doing that research and reading those things, because had I not known that, I would have, the tsunami of hate that I was hit with when the book came out with, I don't know what that would have done to me. But had I been unprepared for it, I'm not sure how low I would have sunk, but I know I would have sunk very, very low. Because, you know, if you look at another area where women are routinely abused, like in sexual assault, for example, we now are at a point where we understand that the first thing you need to do when somebody comes forward with the experience of rape or sexual assault is give them the understanding that, you know, that you're believed, that we, you know, we trust that this is what you've suffered, and that that's the platform from which the woman can move to a position of overcoming. We do not do that with women who've lived prostitution. We very often do the opposite. You're a liar, you're a fantasist, you're a fraud, you're a fake. I've had all of those and many, many more besides. And I'm just very glad that, you know, I was 37 years of age when the book came out. I spoke to a friend of mine, Tanya Rame, a Danish woman who had very similar experiences to me along the same timeline through the 90s. And she said to me when we met recently and spent some time together in England, and she said, you know, if I had spoken out several years before I did, when I was in my 20s, let's say, and had been met with the same reaction that I was met with in my 30s, I think I would have committed suicide. Those were her words, and I know she won't have a problem with me repeating them. Because I said, you know, Tanya, I really do feel that would have been likely for me too. Because I could not, it's strange that I could live with prostitution, I could live with the damage it caused me, I could overcome that and get beyond it. But I don't think I could have dealt with people who hadn't lived it, treating me with such animosity and such hate. Because I would not have been expecting that. It would have been the most cruel, most horrible shock. But anyway, Some women claim that it is their right to prostitute themselves. When I was in prostitution, if I had been asked, do you feel it's your right to prostitute yourself? Of course I would have said yes. Of course I would. Because I was in a situation where I came to prostitution as a 15-year-old homeless child. Nobody was offering me any other options. So my attitude would have been, okay, well, if you're not going to offer me another option, well then of course I have the right to use the body I'm living in to get me out of the situation of destitution that I was in. Of course, that would have made perfect logical sense to me. And added to that, I would have been very aggressively rejecting of anybody cutting off my financial supply by criminalising the men who were buying me if they were not offering me an alternative. And that's why I always say you absolutely cannot bring in any kind of legislation that affects the lives of women in prostitution without offering them alternatives. That's simply a cruelty. And as much as I absolutely believe and know that the men who buy sex ought to be criminalised, I also know that you can't do that without helping those women find another alternative. It's simply not something that I would ever stand over. And this is another thing that's always ignored when I'm told that I'm trying to cause damage to women who are living prostitution. I get that so routinely, and the crazy thing is that I get it usually from women in their early 20s who are liberal feminists who, as I've told them directly, they wouldn't know a her house from a hole in the wall, and how dare they talk to me about what prostitution is. And but they do there regularly. Yeah. So next myth: only sex workers should talk about prostitution because they know best. And the European Women's Lobby, in their response to this, have made the obvious point: should only women who have been victims of domestic violence be entitled to denounce intimate partner violence? You know, of course I believe we should listen to women in prostitution when we're talking about prostitution or legislating about prostitution. But we need to understand what they say in the context of women who are in this situation then. The worst thing you could do, if time machines were on this earth, if they were, you know, anything beyond the fantasy that they are, the very worst thing you could do would be go back to any point in the 90s and ask me what kind of legislation ought to be enacted. That would not work. I would not be looking at the bigger picture of what was best for society, what was best for women, what was best for the world. I would have been thinking about what about me, Rachel Moran, and how this is going to affect me. So by all means listen to women, but understand the context of what it is that they're saying and why. And what the Swedish independent evaluation did was make very clear that women say while they're in prostitution is markedly different to what women say when they've exited. And that's, if we look at any other situation in which women are exploited or abused, and domestic violence is perfect example, we see the very same pattern. Because, I mean, how many of us here in this room, whether we're men or women, have ever known somebody who, either incidentally a man or a woman, who was involved in a harmful, you know, relationship where they were abused, be it physically or verbally or any other way, and then watched a few years go by and have that person turn around and say, oh, thank God I got out of that marriage. You know what I mean? We have all had that, and prostitution is no different. In fact, I know two Canadian girls who were the bitterest of enemies when they worked on the same street. Couldn't stand each other. And now they work together and have done for many years, working towards abolishing prostitution in Canada, because they're in a completely different space, you know, in their minds, and their attitudes are correspondingly different. The next myth here: prostitution is useful for society, especially for socially isolated and lonely men. Okay. So my question, of course, is where were all the socially isolated and lonely men when I was in prostitution? Because if they were that isolated and that lonely, why were all of their cars, most of their cars got baby car seats in the back? And why were most of them wearing wedding rings? You know, this socially isolated and lonely men, oh, they exist, of course, amongst the population of men who prostitute women. But they are very, very, very much in the minority. Just like disabled men, and that's another crew of men who are used to prop up prostitution in this world. I had one physically disabled man in 7 years. Socially isolated and lonely men, I'm quite sure there were a good sprinkling more, maybe a dozen or so, I don't know, but I tell you, neither category of men could anything like compare to the majority of men who were middle-aged, middle-class, married, had children. Prostitution is not something that men do out of desperation. Prostituting women, I should say, is not something that men do out of desperation. Prostituting ourselves is something that women do out of desperation. And we really need to look at the very important difference. Demand will never disappear. Well, my answer to that might seem quite childish. My answer to that is, so what? No. So what? You know, what is your point? The obvious reaction to that one is that murder, unfortunately, will never disappear. Neither will rape, neither will paedophilia, neither will sexual abuse, neither will so many things that we wish we didn't have to live alongside in our society. So what do? Do we throw all of that legislation in the bin too? You know, just say, okay, let's just accept that there's going to be murder and rampages. We can't eradicate murder, so therefore let's just bin this legislation because we have interpreted it as useless since it cannot eradicate. Legislation is not designed to completely eradicate. It's designed to seriously curb and curtail and send the message to society about what is and is not acceptable behaviour. So that demand will never disappear is probably the biggest pile of nonsense in here. Abolishing prostitution would lead to more rapes. That's something that I've been thinking I need to sit down and write a blog post about for several reasons. First of all, I know a woman who worked for a good many years in a centre where, for the treatment of sexual abusers. And according to her, absolutely all of the men, with no exceptions, were punchers, you know, who had bought women. But we really need to completely reject this nonsense. In the Boston study that studied over 100 men who bought sex, what they found was that men who bought sex were markedly more violent in their own intimate relationships, by their own admission, with their own partners. That they were more inclined to be sexually violent, that they were more inclined to treat women as some kind of blow-up-doll sex object. There shouldn't be anything surprising about that. You know, really, it shouldn't be something that we have to convince anybody of. It should be perfectly clear that if men are given the message that women are put on this earth just to be used sexually, to be paid for and used sexually, that some men will absorb that, some, thank God, not all, some men will absorb that and play out that and live that. And if people actually think that men are going to walk into a brothel and behave like a violent chauvinist pig, and then something magical is going to happen on the journey home, where he's going to turn into a decent, respectful man. Well, I mean, they've got to be at least as deluded as these men that we're talking about, because human nature does not work that way. Legalizing prostitution is the best way to guarantee access to basic rights for people in prostitution. The most basic right for people in prostitution is not to be prostituted in the first place. So this is, you know, a load of crap as usual. Anybody who believes this only needs to take a look at Germany. Really, Germany is probably the worst example we've got going on right now. Nevada is mentioned here. Nevada is, there's more rape in Nevada, more recorded rape in Nevada than in any other US state. So that should really say something to you about how the legalisation of prostitution impacts on society. And also, very often I've heard the lie that rape stats in Sweden have gone through the roof since the Swedish law was implemented there. What happened in Sweden was that the categories that, for what rape is understood to be were broadened at that time. The sex purchase law, as they call it there, was only one of many, many laws, and probably you Norwegian people are more aware of this than some people in Western Europe, where I'm from. But I've seen people be sucked in by that argument in Ireland and Britain, because they're not aware that in Sweden there were a whole raft of laws, many laws implemented at that time to strengthen and support women's rights. The idea that prostitution is something that will send out a message whereby men will start treating women with respect and rape will drop. Well, yeah, I've just talked about that. We all know, I hope we all know how crazy that is. But apart from any of that, what it does, I find it really hurtful and insulting. That, because what this argument presupposes is that we should have a category of women who should be used and treated as the human shield of sexual violence. So even if it were possible that a prostituted population of women would alleviate sexual abuse of women outside of that framework, even if that were possible, which it's not, the opposite is true, but even if it were, I still find it dreadfully hurtful and insulting, because of what it says to me very clearly is that every bit of sexual violence I experienced in prostitution was okay, because that was delineated for me and women like me and children like me, and that every other woman outside of that framework was a decent woman who didn't deserve to be abused, but I was, So on a personal level, I find it very insulting, and at this stage in my life, I'm offended for the women who are still in prostitution, because they don't deserve that any more than anybody else does. Right, we must combat trafficking, but prostitution has nothing to do with it. Okay, well, there are so many reasons why that's wrong, and the most obvious one to me is the fact that women who are sex trafficked into the very same sex trade as any other woman. People, feminists and others, politicians and service providers, are engaged in this argument about trafficking versus prostitution as though they were two completely distinct phenomena. But the punters have already made up their minds, and they use both sets of women interchangeably and couldn't give a damn. Recently, I think it was in England, and I must actually track this study down and put it up online. There was an undercover study done to check into what men's attitudes actually were. So they said, advertised this brothel that didn't exist, this virtual brothel, and said, okay, but the women here are trafficked, just kind of keep it to yourself, the women here. Now, I don't know how stupid those men must have been, because nobody would say that, and you would not hear that. The whole cover and the whole ruse is to pretend that the women are not trafficked, just in case somebody calls the police. But in any case, these men were told this fiction, and the majority of them said, "Oh yeah, that's fine, that's okay," and that doesn't surprise me. One of the women I met most recently, an Eastern European woman who was kidnapped off the streets of London, dragged into the back of a van, and prostituted all over Ireland, north and south. She spent years in prostitution in Ireland, and there was no way that you could not have known that this skinny, young, late teenage girl, as she was at the time, was under more serious form of coercion than women in prostitution generally are. There's no way you couldn't have known. And she described to me, and I've seen other women who I've never met on television be interviewed, describe how they were shaken, trembling, crying, fearful. What you need to understand, as sick as it is that there are men who pay for sex who